Meticulous exploration through comparing Scripture with Scripture, the biblical method for revealing truth, mathematical analysis, and ultimately guidance from God's Holy Spirit. So what exactly is the biblical timeline of history? It's a timeline that spans across the Bible, beginning with the first book, Genesis. This timeline then extends into subsequent books and chapters. Why should we invest time in learning about the biblical timeline of history? The answer can be found in Ecclesiastes 8:5. Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. To comprehend the current time or season, understanding past biblical events is essential to understand when future events will occur that the Bible is prophesied about. In Matthew 16, we see Jesus rebuking.
All right. How's it going, everyone? This is Carl. Brian couldn't join us today, so I'll be going over the timeline today. And this is going to be episode 24. And what we're going to do is we're just kind of go through the timeline and do like a recap of everything we've learned from the beginning, and then work our way to where we currently are, and also go over a few new things. So we'll get started right away. Okay. Right. I hope everyone can hear me. You won't be able to respond, but that's okay. All right, so just as a reminder, let me just go ahead and mute Gary. Gary, can you hear me? Okay. Looks like it. Okay, so again, just a reminder to get to the timeline, you want to go to ebiblefellowship.org. And if you scroll down, you'll see the timelines here on the front page. You're also going to see it on the right side, which is right here, biblical timeline. So you can go ahead and click that, or you can click this.
Carl, I can hear you clearly.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yes.
Sounds good. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we're just going to kind of start from the beginning here again, and just I know we're on episode 24, so I figured it's always good to kind of go back and do like a review. So again, and I'm not sure if some people are new, they haven't watched the other episodes yet, so this would be good for them to watch as well. So you see, we started with Adam. He was born he was created on the 6th day, but that would be year 0. I mean, the reason why we say year 0 is because a full year hasn't passed. So we start him there, year 0, and he lived to be 930 years old. Now, if you're not familiar with the timeline, you can click these boxes that highlight, and that will give you the verse that we're using. So in this case, we learn in Genesis 5:3 that Adam lived 130 years. So that's where we get that number, and that's how we know where to place how long he lives. Right. We also went over Kerosem. We could just do a quick review. And if you click this tab right here, this explains what Kerosem is and why it was discovered that was the key phrase that Mr. Camping used to pretty much unlock understanding the timeline, because without knowing Kerosem, most people who attempted, or actually everyone who attempted to try to lay out the timeline, they didn't get past Enos, because the problem is they took every verse at face value, and so they assumed that when somebody was born, or how the Bible lays it out, they assume that each person was born they took, like, for example, this verse right here in Genesis 5:6, it says, and Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. Genesis 5:9, it says Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. So these verses look similar, but we learn from the first verse that Kerosem is used, and the second verse, Kerosem isn't used. And so on the surface, it may seem like Enos at 90 years old begat Canaan, but we learn it's actually a descendant. So starting with Adam, that gets us to, he lives to be 930. Okay. And here's the math if you want to follow along. Okay. And then we learn that at 130, Seth is born. So that's why we place Seth here. And then if you follow along, it says, and Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. And so we know to place Enos right here. And we learn that Enos, oops. Close out of the timeline for a second. So if you click here, we learn that that Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. So we know to place Enos right here. And we see that called his name is used. So we know he's an immediate son. All right. Then when we get to Enos, it says Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. Now again, this would be the first instance where Kerasim is not used. And Mr. Camping understood that if Kerasim isn't used, we don't take this verse at face value. That means it wasn't an immediate son. It was a descendant of some sort. So a grandson, a great-grandson, and so on. And the question is if you don't know where to place Canaan, for example, Enos lived 90 years, most people would assume that Canaan would be born here, right? But that's not the case. And so the only other place to place Canaan would be at the end of Enos's life, which would be right here. Because that's the only other number God gives us is the 905, which is the entire lifespan of Enos. And again, if you continue this pattern, you can work your way all the way through the patriarchs. We won't go through each one of these. This is just kind of a recap. But you'll see most of these are all descendants up until you get to Lamech. So here we get to Methuselah, we get to Lamech, and we know that Lamech, immediate son was Noah, because Kerasim is used, and he called his name Kerasim. So that's how we know that. And then the Bible lets us know Lamech was 182 years. So this is the 182-year mark. Noah is born. And then from here, Kerasim is not really used up until later. It pretty much, the rest of the timeline, we can see that, let's just go over here first. So Noah, if you click on this 502, we learn that Noah was 500 years old and he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, we went over this before. If we take this verse at face value, it would appear that Shem, Ham, and Japheth are all born when Noah was 500 years old. So one might assume that they're twins if you read this verse at face value. But as you go through this, we learn that Shem wasn't born when Noah was 500, but rather 502. And we did this using a little bit of math. So for one, we can prove that there's an immediate father-son relationship because Kerasim isn't used in the case of Noah and Shem. And this is actually the first instance where Kerasim isn't used, but we understand there's an immediate father-son relationship due to the fact that Shem and Noah were on the ark. So that means that they lived at the same time. And we prove that with these verses here. So Noah was 500 years old and begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so this is how we are able to discover that Shem was born when Noah was 502. In Genesis 5:32, we established that Noah begat sons at age 500. And then we learned that when Noah was 600 years old, that's when the flood began. So it says Genesis 7:6, and Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. So that's key information. And we know the flood lasted 1 year. So Noah went from 600 to 601. And we learned that we'll get into that. Okay, Genesis 11:10. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So knowing that Noah was knowing that Noah was 600 years old at the time of the flood, which was right here, is very important because we learned that Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood, which means all you have to do is backtrack. So if Noah was 600 and Shem was 102 years after the flood, you just minus 2. That lets us know that Shem was 98 years old at the time of the flood. And we learned that after the flood didn't mean after, because the flood lasted a whole year. It didn't mean after that event. It meant after the beginning of the flood. And so right here, this makes a difference in the count. So if the flood lasted 1 year, the question is, do you start after the flood ended and count 2 years, or do you count the flood as one whole year? Because the flood lasted a year. And the answer is you count the flood as a whole year. All right. Here we learn that Shem lived to be 600 years old. And okay, from Shem's birth into the flood is 98 years old. Okay. So yeah, here is an interesting junction because this is when the timeline kind of splits off here. And if you continue on down the timeline, you'll see that it's much more detailed as you go down. But from the flood, we learn that there's 7,000 years from when the flood began all the way to May 21st, 2011. So this is like a quick jump into the future. This is the 7,000 years that lands on May 21st of 2011. All right. And then this way is like the longer path to get there. So if we zoom out, it's a much more detailed path. Okay. So again, continuing down the line with the patriarchs, you can read each of these if you click them, but that takes us all the way to the time of Abraham. And then there's more details as you click these boxes here. And then we get into, give me a second. All right, then we get into Isaac, we get into Jacob. And Jacob, we're able to break down his life. If you click on one of these boxes, you'll see his life is broken up into these periods of time. So the first 60 years, this is when Jacob leaves his parents' house and he lives with his uncle Laban. He works the first 7 years, and then the next 7 years, there's 2 wives. He works an additional 20 years and 6 years, and then spends another 30 years. He leaves Laban at the end of the 6-year period. Spends another 30 years before entering into Egypt. He enters into Egypt at 130, which is right here, and then lives an additional 17 years. So his total lifespan is 147. Okay, and again, this information is just a breakdown of his lifespan. It's not necessarily needed. It isn't needed to progress on the timeline because you could just go from Jacob to on downwards, right? But it is important to know when Jacob entered Egypt, because the Bible actually doesn't give us information regarding when Levi entered Egypt. Or we don't know when Levi was born, right? But we know he lived to be 137. You can read about that in the verses that are listed here. It's right here. Okay. And so we know when Jacob entered Egypt. So if we look at these dates, he's born in 2007 BC, right? Which is a 9,006 year of Earth's history. So if you take 2007 BC and you add 130 years, that gives you 1877. So that's when Jacob entered into Egypt, right? And then if you take 1877 and you add 430 years, that gets you to the time of the Exodus, 1447. So you can, this is like a quick path to the Exodus, right? However, if you can actually backtrack from the Exodus, starting when Aaron's 83, and go to Amram, Kohath, and Levi, right? And if you click this, this lays it out, how you can backtrack. So everything in green is covering the 430-year time period. So even though Aaron lived to be 123, you start with 83 because that's how old he was at the time of the Exodus, and you can basically backtrack the 430. So 137 plus 133, and that gives you 83 plus 137 plus 133, that gives you 353. So if you look at the difference between 430 and 353, that leaves an additional 77 years. And so we know that Levi lived a total of 60 plus 77, 137. So the first part of his life, he was 60 years old until he entered Egypt, which left a remainder of 77 years. So this is how we're able to backtrack to figure out when Levi was born. Because if Levi spent 77 years in Egypt, that means he was 60 years old prior to entering in. I mean, from his birth until he entered into Egypt. And so this is how we're able to actually figure out when Levi was born. And it's interesting to note that when Levi was 60, Jacob was 60 years old when he went to go live with Laban. So God does use numbers like that. And again, you can click on this box here to read all this information. It goes more into depth. Okay, so we've gone through the lines of the patriarchs, the 430 years. This lets us know the date of the Exodus, right? And Aaron ends the line of the patriarchs. So he's the 26th patriarch. So at this point, we can't go through patriarchs anymore, but we do have this pivotal date of the Exodus. And you'll notice that this date of the Exodus is used as a critical junction point for projecting future time paths. And we'll get into that a little bit. Okay, and then before we saw that Moses' lifespan of 120 broke down into 3 periods of 40. We got 40, 40, 40. I think we went through this time path. If you can actually continue to add 40s, just like God gave us an example of 40, 40, and 40. If you continue to add 40s, you'll notice that actually takes you through the Judges period, which again is made up of all 40s. You got 40, 360 is made up of 9 40s. 40 times 9, that gives you 360, right? And you'll see the land had rest for 40 years, for 80 years, which is 2 40s, just 40, 40, 40 as a continuation. And this time path right here actually leads you to the first coming of Christ. So this is 11,006, 7 BC, which is the 11,006 year. And it also takes you to the second coming of Christ, which is from 1994 to 2033. So it's a very, very, very interesting time path that takes you to the first and the second coming of Christ. And not to mention, it's made up of all 40s. So from the time when Moses is born all the way until 2033 is just a series of 40 years. So, and we know that the number 40 is the number for testing. Okay. So that's Moses's life is broken up into 40 years there. We learned the date of the Exodus is 1447 BC. And so the question is, where do we go after the Exodus? Well, God gives us this verse that we'll read here in 1 Kings 6:1, and it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So we learn that from the time of the Exodus, so it says after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, so we know that's the time of the Exodus, there is a 480-year period, right? So this allows us to take the date of the Exodus of 1447 and kind of hyper jump into the future from 1447 to 967 BC, right? This is when Solomon lays the foundation of the temple. And we were able to actually, Mr. Camping broke down this 480-year period into 40, 360, 40, and 40. And I'm not sure if he ever broke it down into a stream of 40s, because 360 does break down into 9 sets of 40, as we just showed you. But he did want to figure out how to make the judges fit in with the 360-year period. So, and again, God lets us know that there are 480 years from the Exodus to when Solomon laid the foundation of the temple. So this is just what I like to think of as like a side quest. You can kind of go back and fill in the details here, but it's not necessary to continue on the timeline. So it's extra information that we can look into. Okay. And then if you click this, this will collapse like that. And then, so where do we go from here? So knowing when Solomon laid the foundation of the temple allows us to go through the kings, the 460-year reign of the 43 kings. But before we get into that, I just wanted to point out what this is. So here is a period of 440 years. This starts when Moses is 40 years old. So that's 1487 BC. So this would be right here at this time. Moses turns 40 years old. If you scroll down, it lines up perfectly with that. And this 440-year period starts with Moses, it ends with Samuel. So it ends right here on this line. And that's when the line of the kings begin, right? Remember Samuel, the people wanted a king. So God gave them over to what they wanted, and Saul was the first king. Now in Acts, we read it says judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. So the way that this is able to fit is, well, 450 isn't 440, but it is about 440, right? God uses about, right? And it fits perfectly with 440, because if you start with Moses at 40 years old, it takes you exactly to when Saul began to reign. However, the addition, why God says about 50 years, I'm not really sure, but the additional 10 years right here can be seen when you lay out the kings. You'll notice that I think 10 years later, David is born. So there might be significance, and why God, well, there is significance why he says 450, but we know it's exactly 440 years. Okay. And then, so right here, we're at this junction in time. This is the 480-year period. Starts when the Exodus, ends when Solomon lays the foundation of the temple. And so from here, we have to go through the kings to continue on. And of course, we're actually going to find out with the kings that they only take us to 539 BC, right? And so if we want to progress in the timeline, we actually have to backtrack, and we'll get into that afterwards. So if you click here, the 460-year reign of the kings, if you click on this timeline right here, right there, have it on a new tab. I'll let that load. That's going to take us through all the kings, and we laid this all out. We spent quite a few episodes going through this whole thing, but if you zoom out, you'll see all the kings are laid out just like this. And when Solomon dies, the kingdom splits. So you got the line of the kings of Judah, the lines of the kings of Israel. And you can see where they line up exactly. And this is very precise information. And it all fits like a puzzle. You know, it actually looks like a puzzle. And that takes you all the way down into at the time when the last king reigns, which is Jehoiakim. Or sorry, Zedekiah. He's the last king of Judah. And then Nebuchadnezzar, you can see him reigning here. We're not going to go through this all, but I did want to point out that if you scroll down, so you got King Saul, he reigns for 40 years. And we'll see here on this timeline that this 480-year period the Bible talks about, the first 40 years was the wilderness sojourn. Then you have the Judges period. And then this is when Saul reigns, this 40 years. And so that is why this 480-year period overlaps the reign of the kings, right? So it's the reign of the kings has already begun with 80 years of time that has gone by. So that's King Saul, and then we have King David, who also reigns for 40 years, and he makes up the second 40, which is right here. So 40 and 40 is 80. So from the Exodus, go 400 years, that gets you right here. And then another 80 years, you're already into the end of the reign of King David. So that's that overlap there. Okay. And then, so understanding these kings, we won't get into the kings, but how Mr. Camping discovered this is because we didn't know when King Saul began to reign, which is 1047 BC, but we did know this date, which is the 4th year of when Solomon laid the foundation of the temple, because the Bible lets us know of the 480-year period. So from the Exodus to Solomon's 4th year, we're able to backtrack from this junction point right here. And that's what this is right here. This is that 480-year period from the Exodus. So if we know Solomon reigned for a total of 40 years, you're just backtracking 4 years, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. This is his 5th non-accession year, but his 4th accession year, right? And then from King Solomon, we were able to backtrack all the way through David's rule, which is 40 years. And then we're able to backtrack more for another 40 years, and that's King Saul, right? And that's how we can figure out when King Saul reigned and King David, right? You have to backtrack that way. So, it's very interesting to see, like, on the timeline, it's not just a matter of going forward. Sometimes you have to actually backtrack to fill in certain details. So this just adds more to the complexity of the timeline. Okay, so yep, the king that starts in 1047 and it ends, go to the very bottom, ends in 587. So 1047 plus 587 is a period of 460 years. So that's why we say that the reign of the kings is 460 years. Okay. So moving on, once we get to the end of the kings, we learn of this 70-year Great Tribulation. I'm going to zoom in here. Probably hard to see. So we're going to go back to the king's timeline for a second. And we find out that there was a 70-year Great Tribulation period, which began when the last faithful king, King Josiah, who's the last good king of Judah, right? He dies in 609 BC, and that's when that 70-year Great Tribulation begins. So we're going to read about that here. So if you come here, and you'll notice that this 70-year tribulation doesn't start at the end of 460 years. It starts a little bit before. So that means there are some kings that are still reigning during this period, even though the tribulation has started, right? So there's an overlap there. And we've actually broken down the tribulation here. So you'll see it begun in 609 BC, which is the 10,404 year of Earth's history. That's when the captivity begun. And then we learn that there's a second part of this Babylonian captivity. So 22 years out of a 70-year tribulation is this point right here. We're going to learn more about that in just a little bit. But that's 587 BC, right? And then it ends in 539 BC. So this is kind of like a breakdown of the 70-year tribulation. And we didn't really get too much into this in the previous episode. So this is kind of just like an overview, a recap, and then, getting us to this point in time, which is right here. So if you click on this 7-year tribulation, we'll read this. Okay. So it says, we've learned of a 70-year tribulation when going through the king's timeline. The kings of Israel had died out 100 years prior, which is 709 BC, to King Josiah's death. So if you go on the timeline here, on the king's timeline, zoom out, we'll see that the line of the kings of Israel died off in 709 BC, right? 709 BC. Exactly 100 years later is when King Josiah dies. He dies in 609 BC. So from the time of the kings of Israel died off until King Josiah dies, and this is when that 7-year tribulation takes place, there's 100 years that have passed. Exactly. So the kings of Israel had died out 100 years prior to 709 BC to King Josiah's death, and only the kings of Judah remained. However, soon after, well, let me zoom in here. Zoomed out too much. Okay, only the kings of Judah remained. However, soon after, we learned the last good king was King Josiah. Once he was out of the picture, God brought judgment upon the nation of Israel and made them go through a 70-year tribulation period. And we learn about this in the following verses. So this is Jeremiah 25:11. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Jeremiah 25:12. And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith Jehovah, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations. All right, this is Jeremiah 29:10. For thus saith Jehovah, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you, in causing you to return to this place. And then in Daniel 9:2, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years, whereof the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. And so this is where we learn about how long this tribulation lasted, right? 70 years. Okay. Just check on something here. All right. So moving on. Now we've learned from the Bible there are 3 main tribulations, which we'll get into more later. So as we progress later on the timeline, we're going to get into this subject more, especially when we get to around the date of 1994. But we'll touch upon it now. So now we learned from the Bible there are 3 main tribulations, which we'll get into more later. But each tribulation is broken up into 2 parts. We'll also see how Mr. Camping discovered a time path that started from the second part of the first tribulation and lands on the second part of each tribulation. The Babylonian captivity started the same year King Josiah died in 609 BC. However, Josiah was not the last king of Judah. There were a few others. So you'll see on the timeline, the first part of the 70-year tribulation lasted 22 years out of the 70 years. So you'll see right here, this is the 70 years. When we get to 587 BC, that's 22 years into this tribulation. That takes us to 587. This is when the last king of Judah reigned, Zedekiah, also known as Mathaniah. So we'll go back to this timeline. So King Josiah, right? He dies in 609 BC. And then 22 years later, Zedekiah is removed from being king in 587. So this marks the 22-year mark out of a 70-year tribulation. Right? And this ends the line of the kings right here, this 22-year. So again, we saw that there's an overlap here. So what happened is he rebelled against the king of Babylon. Right? So 2 Kings 24:18. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hamatul, not sure how to pronounce that properly, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. 2 Kings 24:19. And he did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. And verse 20. For through the anger of Jehovah it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. As a result, this is what happened to Zedekiah. Verse 7 of 2 Kings 25. And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him with fetters of brass, and carried him into Babylon. So that happens exactly the same year that ends the line of the kings, which happens to be the 22nd year into this 70-year tribulation. Right? So basically what's happening is Nebuchadnezzar has taken over as the king. We'll see that here on the timeline. He's already taken over, and he's begun his rule in 605, right? Which is the year right after King Josiah dies. So these kings are still allowed to reign, right? But under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. And finally, it gets to a point where, due to Zedekiah's rebellion, he's just completely out of the picture. There's no more kings. And so we could say that Nebuchadnezzar became the only king, and these kings were put out as far as earthly king. Okay. Zoom in here. So this all happened 22 years into the 70-year tribulation. 48 years remained until King Cyrus takes over Babylon and slays Belshazzar in 539 BC. So we get to the 22-year mark, and then that leaves us 48 years remaining of the Babylonian captivity, and that lands us in 539 BC. And this date is the date that we've learned that King Cyrus takes over Babylon. And you can read about that in the book of Daniel. You go to Daniel chapter 5. This is when Belteshazzar is having the feast. And then you have the writing on the wall, right? And in the very last verse, it says, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So 62 years old. And when this happened, that's 539 BC. Right? So that ends the 70-year tribulation. Now, you can see how this parallels the third tribulation, which begins in 1988, and its first part lasts 6 years to 1994. Then it's followed by 17 years until 2011 for a total of 23 years. This is why the Babylonian tribulation is this is why the Babylonian tribulation is picturing the Great Tribulation, just like the kings of Babylon. So that would be Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar. Those both typify Satan, ruled during the 70-year tribulation. So too did Satan rule in the churches for 23 years. And what followed is Cyrus took over Babylon, right? Just like Christ took over the kingdoms of this world on May 21st, 2011. So this tribulation was a physical event, but it was actually spiritually representing something that was going to happen in the future, right? So the 70-year tribulation represented the 23-year tribulation that was on the churches, right? Where Satan was given rulership in the churches, and he was given, and he was allowed to continue to rule in the world, right? And then you can see at the end of the 70-year tribulation, what follows is Cyrus takes over the kingdoms of Babylon, and he's a picture of Christ. Well, so too, on 2011, right after the 23-year Great Tribulation, Christ takes over the kingdoms of this world. So there's very much a parallel here. Okay. So the first tribulation started, so we're going to kind of backtrack here. The first tribulation started in Joseph's day. So when Jacob enters Egypt in 1877 BC, it was already 2 years into a 7-year tribulation, also known as the 7 years of famine. So here we kind of break down each tribulation. So we have the first tribulation, the second one, and the third tribulation. This is not to be confused with Chris wrote a book about two tribulations at the end of the world. That's referring to the Great Tribulation and then this tribulation of Judgment Day. These would be, first tribulation would be what we're referring to as the 7 years of famine in Joseph's day. So that lasted 7 years. The second part was, so the second part began 2 years into the 7 years, right? And then that leaves you with the remainder of 5 years. This is a typo. This should be 5. So 2 years in, that's the second part of that tribulation. And that second part is when Jacob enters into Egypt. So as soon as Jacob enters into Egypt in 1877 BC, the famine has already 2 years have already come to pass, right? And so that's a junction point right there. And then that leaves a remainder of 5 years, right? The second tribulation lasted for 70 years, right? And the second part of this second tribulation was 22 years out of 70 years. So you can see a similar parallel. 2 years out of 7 years. This is 22 years out of 70 years. And that leaves you with the remainder of 48 years, similar to how this had a remainder of 5 years in this tribulation. And then finally, the third tribulation in view is what's known as the Great Tribulation, right? This lasted 23 years. The second part was 6 out of 23 years. So you recall from 1988 to 1994 was that 6-year period, right? And then 17 years later is 2011. So there was a remainder of 17 years for this tribulation. And again, it's similar. This tribulation is broken up into 2 parts. So each of these have 2 parts. All right. And so now we're going to see a time path that basically kind of bridged all of these tribulations together, right? So Mr. Camping discovered in Daniel, we read about the 1290. 1,100. Daniel 12:11. Okay. In Daniel 12:11, it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there should be 1,290 days." So that number 1,290 is an important number because that's what Mr. Camping used to discover this time path, right? So it's going to bridge each of these tribulations together. So if you click here, show time path, I'm going to zoom out here. Make this full screen. All right, so you'll see that what he did with the 1290 is he applied it to the first tribulation, right? So this would be the tribulation of Joseph's day. So if we scroll up, we'll see Joseph right here. So you'll see you have the 7 years of plenty and you have the 7 years of famine. Each of these green represent 7 years, right? So 2 years into this 7 years of famine, right? That's the year 1877. That's the exact point that you start the 1290. So 1877 BC is the second part of that 7-year tribulation, right? And so what he did is he took from that point 1,290 years, and where does that land you on? That lands you exactly on the second part of the 70-year tribulation, which is right here. And you can see this. We just went over the 70 years. This is the 22-year mark, which marks the second half of that tribulation. It lines up exactly with 587 BC. And this is when Zedekiah had his eyes plucked out, right? It ends his reign. So that 1290 takes you from Joseph's second year of the famine exactly to 587 BC, right? And again, if you take the 1290 and replicate it again, that takes you to, you do that twice. So 1290, and then you do it again, 1290. And that takes you to the second part of the 23-year tribulation, which is 1994, right? And we just went over that the Great Tribulation was also broken up into two parts. So you have the first 6 years, and then you have the remainder 17 years. Well, this takes you to exactly to 1994, which marks the second part of that tribulation. So again, just to show how amazing this is, it's the second part of this first tribulation. It's the second part of this second tribulation here. And it's the second part of this third tribulation. And if you total these together, that's 1290 times 3. That's 3870. Also, furthermore, what's interesting about this, and this kind of locks us in more, is this 1290 is actually part of this 430-year period of affliction, right? So Jacob enters Egypt when that affliction began, right? If you click this time path right here, oh, I don't think it's working. Here we go. So here we can see that from the date of 1877, what we just looked at here, the second part of the 7-year tribulation, and you go to the time of the Exodus, that's exactly 430 years, right? So this is like another breakdown of this time path. And then if you go another 430 plus another 430, that equals 1290. So essentially what's happening is the 1290 is broken up into 3 parts of 430. So 430 plus 430 plus 430, we can see on the calculator, we times that by 3, that equals 1290. So again, this was further evidence that we should apply it to the 1292 when Joseph, the 7 years of famine began, the second year into the 7 years of famine. And again, the next 1290 is broken up into 3 periods of 430. And then from there, it's broken up into another 3 periods of 430. So in total, we have 9 430s, right? And this also shows how we can take, this shows proof that we can take things like this, like the 430, and replicate it. You know, God has given us this example. And we've done this over here with Moses, right? If you do that with Moses's lifespan, we land when Christ was crucified, 33 AD. We learned that, I think, with Abraham. If you take his lifespan and you click that right there, Abraham takes you to the year 2023/2034, which it depends on the count. If you start the count, then it lands in 2033. And then we also saw with Ishmael, his time path takes us to 2029. So here we're getting into like time paths, right? So we no longer have patriarchs that we're going through. Now it's a matter of time jumps. So we did like a time, this is like a time path right here. Going through the kings, wasn't so much a time path, it was more just going individually through the kings. But we do have this time path from this tribulation all the way to 1994. And so we're going to get more into this later when we get to the date of 1994, but this is actually one of the proofs for the date of 1994, and why this date was significant, if anyone's wondering. So I did want to save this for when we got further on the timeline, but you really can't do that because once you start talking about this tribulation, you want to get more into how it all connects with the other tribulations, right? Okay. We don't have too much time left, so I'll be wrapping this up pretty soon. But yeah, once we get past the tribulation, then let me refresh the page here. Okay. So once we get past the tribulation, we don't really know where to go from this point, right? And so what Mr. Campion had to do is he had to actually backtrack, because once you get to the end of the tribulation, which is 539 BC, we don't have the knowledge of what comes in between this. Like this would be around the time of Esther, right? But I left out any dates because we don't really know for sure. There's this historical evidence, but at least I don't know in the Bible, like if we can pinpoint exact dates for Esther and that information, but that would fit in this timeline, right? So basically, to get to from here to here, we had to backtrack all the way back to the crossing of the Jordan. So that was 1407 BC, right? 1407 BC. Let's check on this real fast. So if we go up to the Exodus, we broke down this period of time, right? The 480 years. Right. And that got us to the crossing of the Jordan. So at the end of Moses's life, this is when the crossing of the Jordan began. So 1447, if you add 40 years, that's 1487. That's, sorry, 1407. Let's do the math here. So 1447 plus the 40 years of the wilderness sojourn, that takes you to 1407. So this is when they crossed over Jordan. So this time path, right, is when they crossed over Jordan. And this is where we learned about the Jubilee. For some reason, some things aren't working on my browser. I think it's because I have to update Chrome. But essentially, we found out that a Jubilee is every 50 years. I mean, if you click on this, you'll learn about the verses that we shared. And so if we start from the crossing of the Jordan and go 50 years, that's a Jubilee, right? So Jubilee here, 50 years later is another Jubilee. And if you do that 28 times, that lands you exactly in the year 7 BC, or the 11,006th year of Earth's history, right? And so this is how, we were able to discover when Christ was born. And there's other proofs for this. So this is one proof, right? It lands in the 11,006th year. We've also seen with David how this parallels with his reign. So if we scroll up, see. So David, he begins to reign in the 10,006th year of Earth's history, also 1007 BC, right? 1,000 years later is 7 BC, which is also the 11,006th year. So, and David reigns for 40 years. And so we see a parallel with his life beginning in 1007 BC. And we see that he dies in 967, which equates to the 10,046 year, right? So Christ lived to be almost about 40 years old, just in the same time span that David reigned. So we see a parallel there with David's life, and David is a picture of Christ, right? So this is more information that locks in that Christ was born in this year. And we'll go over this stuff more. Brian's been going over Christmas and that information. But yeah, this is basically where we stop. So we're going to continue to go through this in the next few sessions that we have. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out is that, well, I'll bring it up now. I was hoping to lay out like a chart for this information. But if you start with Jacob, you see that he's born right here, which is 2007 BC. But that's the 9,006th year of Earth's history, right? We just learned that David began to reign 1,000 years later in 10,006. And then 1,000 years later, Christ is born. And then you go 2 more thousands and you land at 13,006. That's 1994, right? So we have another time path that takes us from Jacob to when David began to reign to when Christ was born. And 2,000 years later, we land in 1994. And so if you line these all up, there's a parallel, right? So again, this is just more information that makes it fit for Christ being born in 7 BC. And there's more stuff we'll go over later. And then one final thing I wanted to point out is we couldn't go from 539 BC to Christ without first backtracking, right? From the crossing of the Jordan, 2850s later, Christ is born, right? Now, I did calculate the time from 539 BC to 7 BC, and that's 532 years. And I'm not sure what the significance is, but I did find out that that does break down. If you break it down, it's 14 times 38. So it's 14 periods of 38 years, which I thought was kind of interesting because Christ, his lifespan was 38 and a half years. And so I didn't know if that was significant at all. It's not actually exactly 39 years. It was calculated to be 38 and a half. That's why we have 38.5, but we round it to 39 years because it matches the lifespan of the reign of King David, right? Anyways, I'm not saying that means anything. I just thought that was kind of interesting. But it's already time for the panel, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. And God willing, we'll pick this up next Sunday. Thanks for joining.